Thanks for checking out the BoshNRoll channel. If you want to see me play your deck, hang out with me in the amazing BoshNRoll community in Discord, access to my lists and sideboard guides before tournaments, book an individual coaching session, or just generally want to support what's going on here, check out the Patreon and YouTube membership options. For the finest Magic the Gathering apparel on the market, use code BoshNRoll for 10% off your order at coalesceapparel.shop. Moxfield.com is the easiest way to build a Magic deck online. If you want to play what I'm playing, use my affiliate link to support the channel while you shop for cards at tcgplayer.com and play any deck anytime on Magic Online with a cardhoarder.com loan account. Thanks for being here. Let's go play some Magic. Hello and welcome to my final installment of the Eternal Weekend 2022 saga. I released a bunch of testing videos and this is it. This is my tournament report from that weekend. First of all, let's start this video off with a vulgar display of power. Just straight up pornography on the YouTubes. Don't demonetize me for this. I finished a project that's been in the works for just short of 13 years this weekend. I got my first piece of power in 2010, and I bought my last Bazaar of Baghdad's this past weekend at Eternal Weekend to complete the vintage pillar collection, I guess. I tried to think of a cooler word than collection, but for those of you not super versed in vintage, generally the pillars are Blue, Workshop, and Bazaar. And it took me a while, but worked up my Mish's Workshops, worked up my Bazaar of Baghdad's, and the adventure is complete. I can now play whatever I want in vintage, and shout out to Michael Caffrey from Tales of Adventure and Rodney Bedell from Backpack Dealer. For real, Rodney's great. Check him out on Twitter and stuff. And everyone else involved in this project over the last 13 years, but got some good deals to finish things out, and I'm very excited about this. This is what Eternal Weekend's all about. Laying cards like this out on a table for a picture. Well, feels good. Getting this thumbnail image out of the way here, let's talk about the actual tournament. As usual, I will just be scrolling through my Twitter feed, my Twitter updates for the event. If you want to get these things in real time, follow me at BoshNRoll on Twitter. But yeah, let's do this thing. Eternal Weekend started on Friday with the Vintage main event. The hall looking good. A lot of Eternal gamers ready to go. And I just want to shout out real quick Card Titan and the Card Titan staff. Nick Koss, the TO, he is switching his brick and mortar store, and he ran the Magic at PAX Unplugged the week before Eternal Weekend. And Eternal Weekend was offered to him with about a month of lead time. Most TOs would say no way, and that's what happened in Europe. Europe didn't get an Eternal Weekend this year because all the TOs were like, are you kidding, WotC? With a month notice, nobody could do that. But Nick Koss did it on top of PAX Unplugged and on top of moving his brick and mortar store. All his staff are just rock stars, and you could not tell from being at the event at all that it was thrown together on such short notice. High quality event, good vendors, good people. I just had a great time, and shout out to everyone who made it happen. As usual, any Philly tournament starts with pretzel breakfast from Miller's. Got the steak, egg, and cheese on day one. Feeling good about it. Always happy to go there. Round one, I played against Bant Initiative. Noble Fish is a deck that's existed for quite some time. It uses Noble Hierarch to pull ahead on resources and use scrappy creatures. These days known as stack spaces. In my day known as hate bears. Hate bear stacks pieces to incremental advantage. You're also a blue deck, so you get Ancestral Recall, Time Walk, all that stuff. And this one added White Plume Adventurer. So they had an extra layer of what they're doing. Luckily, my deck, which I just realized I didn't talk about, we'll go talk about my list in a second. My deck is busted, and it plays enough creature respect, so it's not going to get stuffed by decks like this. And I was able to just overpower them with busted Magic cards, which we will now review out of order. Okay, here's my vintage deck. This is Grixis Tinker Breach. Bryant Cook released a 5.0 video on the Epic Storm YouTube a couple days before Eternal Weekend. I put my testing leagues up on my channel as well. I knew I was going to be in the blue Tinker world. I wasn't sure if I was going to play Breach or not. Bryant convinced me with this kind of breach heavy deck. It actually has 2 breaches, not just 1. And it's not messing around with any hull breachers, any opposition agents. There is no side plan in the main deck. There is Tinker, there is Breach, and that's how you win games. I really like that approach because since you have no creatures of your own, you get to go pretty heavy on stuff like Dress Down. There are 2 Dress Downs in the main here, which is really good against White Initiative. It's really good in the Urza Saga mirrors. It's really good against the Hate Bear decks that I just mentioned, such as Bant Initiative. I love a Dress Down, and it was not hard to sell me on this list. The only thing I changed from Bryant's list is at his recommendation, he put Sphinx of the Steelwind in the main deck and no Blightsteel Colossus in the 75. We all kind of agreed that this was the better Tinker robot to get for the weekend. And I turned his 3 Pyroblasts in the main into 2 Pyroblasts and a Lightning Bolt. And I turned his 2 Lightning Bolts in the sideboard into a Blast Lightning Bolt. I think Lightning Bolt's a rock star in Vintage. It just hits the Hate Bears. It hits a lot of the stuff out of actual workshops. It can pick off Planeswalkers. And if you have 1 in a Vintage deck, that's actually a lot more than in a Legacy deck because you have Mystical Tutor, Demonic Tutor, Vampiric Tutor, Ancestral Recall. You have lots of ways to find that thing. And sometimes you just need it. We're going to see later on in the tournament, little spoiler, how lack of a harder removal spell than Lightning Bolt actually came back to bite me, but Lightning Bolt was a rock star, including in that matchup against Bant Initiative that I just talked about. My opponent had our game 2, they played some creature on turn 1, and I bolted it in their end step and untapped and won. And it was very easy because I had Lightning Bolt, just didn't need to worry about anything they were going to do on turn 1. Collect a Roof, Archon of Emeria, who cares? It's dead. Now you're dead too. And I just love a Lightning Bolt in a deck. I mentioned the Tinker robot. I mentioned Breach. Bolas's Citadel can get things going. You have Time Vault and Manifold Key as well to take infinite turns. Urza Saga can tutor up the Manifold Key, so you can use Tinker to find the Time Vault. Tinker can also find Black Lotus, which is half of your Breach combo. There's just a lot of A plus Bs. This is kind of 2-card Monty in a really good controlling shell. And you just use your tutors and card draw to sculpt together whatever AB is going to happen in the game, and then you make it happen. 2 Tabernacles in the sideboard might seem egregious, but that's really good against the Bizarre Baghdad decks. A lot of those decks put a lot of creatures into play without making a lot of mana. Sometimes they actually have 0 mana and then 8 to 12 creatures in play, and then they all just die. A lot of Bizarre decks are playing Gaia's Cradle just as counter hate to Tabernacle. It's a real thing that they have to respect. Then a bunch of Leylines, Opposition Agent, Hurkyl's Recall, Flusterstorm, the Pyroblast I mentioned, and 2 Pithing Needles. I went with 2 Pithing Needles because I thought that Bizarre was going to be popular. Bizarre is more accessible than other Vintage decks. It might seem crazy to call a deck that plays a playset of $2,500 cards accessible, but I mean relative. A lot of the Bizarre decks don't play the full power. They don't have blue, so you don't need Ancestral Time Walk. Mishra's Workshop plays all of the artifact power plus a set of workshops. Bizarre is kind of a budget deck in the Vintage scheme of things, and Pithing Needle just shuts that down while also having lots of text in Urza Saga mirrors and against Mishra's Workshop. So 3 Pithing Needle across the 75 is the heaviest I've ever gone, but it felt right for the weekend. That's my deck. We'll reference it if we need to. Let's get back to this tournament report. I beat Bant Initiative. We talked about that. One of the most striking things about Eternal Weekend, and this has been true the last couple years, but it's especially true now that I have a content platform in the space. I couldn't walk 10 feet without getting pulled into some conversation with some great person who I either was meeting for the first time or hadn't seen in 2 or 3 years, and just it's so special to be in that environment. It feels like a hangout convention, but there's also a real tournament on the line. It kind of synthesizes a lot of things I've been feeling lately about engaging with Magic and paper. Like my Magic 30 experience in Vegas, I wanted to win tournaments, but I also wanted to hang out with all my friends, and all my friends were playing Commander. And I feel like I lost a couple days playing in the tournaments, but I also won money in the tournament to pay for the weekend, which is what I want out of a Magic convention. So Eternal Weekend, you get to hang out with all the awesome people where the main event is the point of being there. And it's just really nice to, this is exactly what I want out of a Magic event. And I got it. It is so nice. Another community thing, somebody asked me for a signature, which is something that happens when I'm out and about. And rather than a Ponder or an Uro or a Monk token, which are the things I'm usually signing, they had me sign on the dotted line of Contract from Below, which is just freaking awesome. And then they showed me their binder full of other people who have signed on the dotted line, including Mark Rosewater, and here's Mark Poole, Mark Tadine. It's a great project with all these contracts that having people that he likes sign them, and I'm honored to be part of this project. In round 2, I played against Dan Miller, who is a old format legend from the American Northeast. He was on Survival, which is a Bazaar deck. And like I mentioned with those Pithing Needles, Bazaar deck and Survival adds additional hits for Pithing Needle, plus Survival is a Wasteland Strip Mine deck and a Life from the Loam deck. So lots of hits for Pithing Needle in that. I won game 1 just by doing something busted. I forget exactly what. Game 2 and 3 were both really interesting, though. In game 2, I had Tinkered for Sphinx of the Steelwind, and Survival is a base green deck. Sphinx of the Steelwind has protection from green. Their out is Beseiju Who Endures. So I Pithing Needled Beseiju Who Endures. And then while that was going on, I also hard cast a Leyline of the Void. So he couldn't add to his graveyard, couldn't kill my Sphinx, and had to get through the Pithing Needle while taking 6 points of lifelink, and his creatures couldn't attack. I felt pretty untouchable, and on the final turn of that game, he dredged a Loam that was in his graveyard from before I cast the Leyline, and just exiled 3 cards, cast the Loam, picking up 3 lands that were already in the graveyard from before the Leyline. That gave him enough cards in hand to pad a Bazaar activation, and he drew 2 cards, discarded the 3 lands he just picked up. And then the 2 cards left in his hand, plus the mana in play, he had exactly enough mana to cast Foundation Breaker, yes, the Modern Horizons 2 evoke creature, which destroyed my Pithing Needle. And then his last card in hand was Beseiju Who Endures, which he had channeled on my Sphinx of the Steelwind, and then was able to just pick me apart with what had been locked behind the Sphinx. I was at like 28 life or something at the time, but it went away very quickly from there. I was all in on that plan, and he picked his way through it. It was very exciting. In game 3, though, I returned the favor of playing extremely well with I turn 1 on the play. I had turn 0 Leyline of the Void, and my hand also had Pithing Needle in it, which I can name Bazaar, and then he doesn't have a graveyard, and he can't use Bazaar to dig for an answer to Leyline of the Void. But I didn't have counter magic, and Force of Vigor would cleanly kill both of those things, and then he could just do whatever he wanted. So I didn't play the Pithing Needle. Instead, I played like land Sensei's Divining Top, passed the turn, just hope that the Leyline held up for a turn, so I didn't just die. And he didn't Force of Vigor right away. He played Bazaar Go. And then on my turn, I kept trying to make Force of Vigor feel juicy. So I played an Urza Saga, which is an enchantment. And if you haven't seen this before, Urza Saga doesn't tap for mana until the triggered ability, when it comes into play and reaches Chapter 1, resolves. So I put Urza Saga into play and kind of made a little show of trigger and reach for a die. And he was like, oh, hold up. And then Force of Vigored my Urza Saga before it could tap for mana and my Leyline of the Void. And then I used my land from the previous turn to Pithing Needle Bazaar. And then locking down the Bazaar gave me the breathing room to win the game. That was one of those moments where taking the obvious play would have lost the game on the spot, and just got to sandbag and dance around it a little bit until he pulled the trigger, and then I was able to push through. Round 3, I played against Esper Paradoxical Outcome. It was actually somebody who introduced themselves to me earlier in the day as a fan of the content, and we had a chat, and I knew what he was playing because we had that chat, and he knew what I was playing because we had that chat. And we went back and forth. Paradoxical Outcome is a deck that I love, and I think it's among the most powerful decks in Vintage. I think if a deck is just allowed to do whatever it wants, Paradoxical Outcome is near the top of that scale. Maybe like Dark Petition Storm. I mean, people's definition of raw power is going to come into play here, and I'm sure I'll get some angry comments, but I think if a deck is allowed to do whatever it wants, Paradoxical Outcome is near the top of the spectrum, but it is very soft, much softer to Null Rod, Flusterstorm, Pyroblast, all this commonly played hate than the Tinker decks are. PO is also a Tinker deck, by the way, but it also has PO. We split game 1 and 2. I think game 1 he just went for it, like a turn 1 PO for 5, and I had the force, and that was his whole plan, and he just did the old, you're 40% to have it, let's try. And then game 2, he was able to get through my counter magic. Oh, game 2, I remember what happened. Oh my god, I'll never forget this. I amassed a bunch of resources, and Gitaxian probed him, and I saw Paradoxical Outcome and some blank, some card that just doesn't matter. My hand had Flusterstorm and Pyroblast in it, and I was like, okay, it's fine. I think I had like the win set up for a next turn, but I wanted to make sure that he couldn't PO, so I passed the turn, and he drew for a turn, played a Gitaxian Probe off the top of the deck that I did not see, so I knew he had just drawn it. He saw that I had Flusterstorm, Pyroblast, drew off of Gitaxian Probe, and then tapped 4 mana. And in my head, I'm like, okay, here comes the PO. He's just going to start working through my counter magic. But then he cast Karn the Great Creator, which is a card that is restricted in Vintage. And the top of his deck produced Gitaxian Probe to check for counter magic, and then the one card that beats me. And he was able to win game 2 off of that, which was pretty cool because I did some coaching with somebody leading up to this event who was also playing Esper PO, and we had a long conversation about Karn. Is this a card that you want to include in your deck? And we determined that you do, because it just wins games, and it sure did. Just took that one out of nowhere. And then game 3, I was on the play. I had a hand that could play Mana Vault on turn 1 and then Voltaic Key on turn 2. But so I kept it, and I played the Mana Vault past the turn, and my opponent cast Tinker and showed me 2 Force of Wills in their hand, and I just died without getting to even cast the key. Welcome to Vintage. This video is sponsored by Moxfield.com, the easiest way to build Magic decks online. Moxfield supports over 30 formats, including Legacy and every other format you'll see on this channel. They have multiple customizations so you can view your deck how you want. Text view, stacks, grid, custom grouping by type, subtype, color, light mode, dark mode. However you want to see your deck, they can provide it for you. My favorite feature is you can choose your set printing, make the deck look exactly how you want it to. The deck screen features expandable sections that show you what tokens your deck makes, your recent change history to the deck, stats about mana curve and opening hand distribution, mana cost distribution. You can deal out sample hands and even play test the deck. Island Ponder. You know I'm keeping this one. This site has everything. Follow me on Moxfield.com to keep up with decks I'm playing for the channel and what I'm up to in paper. I'll see you there. And at the table next to me, former Vintage champion and known mad scientist of brewing, Brian Kelly, was playing, and I saw him exile a Peak to Force of Will. And that just made me so happy, because Brian, I count on playing weird cards that you haven't seen in Vintage before, and he had Peak. He registered Peak. He also ended up winning the High Roller event on Sunday. He did not top 8 the main event, but he won a Mox Pearl on Sunday, so he still had a pretty good weekend with his weirdo Peak deck. Round 4, I played against a Tinker Breach Grixis Mirror. We had kind of a weird game 1 where I didn't know what he was on, but I kept a hand that had 2 Urza Sagas, Soul Ring, and a Force of Will. There's no source of colored mana at all, but I could just get ugly with Urza Saga, which is really powerful in Vintage. That is a way to win a game. And we ended up exchanging a bunch of resources. I forced a will, a spell that mattered. He used a removal spell, or something, I don't remember the details, but basically it came down to there was a final turn where my hand, I had drawn like Pyroblast, Flusterstorm, all these things I couldn't cast. And I used my first Urza Saga to tutor for Mox Sapphire, which turned on my blue cards. Then I used my second Urza Saga to tutor for Mox Ruby, which turned on my red cards. And I was able to just exactly punch through what he was doing, one spell at a time, and get over the finish line with Sagas, or Saga tokens. Then game 2, I mulled to 5 on the draw, and we had some small exchange. It was like fetch land, go, or I think I might have had a Mox. Yeah, it was like Mox, fetch land, go, and then he tutored for Ancestral Recall but didn't cast it. And then in his end step, I fetched, and in response to my fetch, which would have given me red mana to Pyroblast his Ancestral, he cast in his Ancestral, and that tapped him out going into my turn, but he did have 3 new cards in hand. And I was just like, this isn't getting better for me. While you're tapped out, throw Tinker onto the stack. And it resolved. After the game, he showed me that he had Pyroblast or Flusterstorm, one of the above, but used the 1 blue mana that he had to Ancestral instead, and didn't find Force, which got my Bolas' Citadel into play. But the Citadel didn't just win, because if you hit 2 lands, Citadel has to stop. You can cast all your spells for life, but you only still get 1 land drop per turn. I ran into some lands off of Citadel and had to pass. Then I ran into some lands again after drawing some cards and putting some Moxen into play. Had to pass again. And now we're in my 3rd turn with Bolas' Citadel in play. My life total is getting kind of low. I have 6 cards in hand, and it's Time Vault, Force of Will, and 4 lands. And in his head, I'm sure he's thinking like, oh god, a 6-card vintage hand with Bolas' Citadel in play. I'm never beating this. But my hand was pretty soft. I had no blue card to pitch to the Force. The Time Vault was not doing what it needed to do. I didn't have the key yet. So I had to pass the turn again. And I was able to flip Opposition Agent off of Bolas' Citadel to steal his Urza Saga tutor, which got me a Black Lotus out of his deck. So I got his Black Lotus, and I untapped one more time and hit Runner lands off of, sorry, this detail's important. My Urza Saga popped in my draw step and put key into play. But then I runnered lands again off of the Bolas' Citadel. I'm in the same spot as last turn, but now I have his Black Lotus and Manifold Key in play. I have Time Vault, Force of Will in my hand, but no blue card. But now I have enough mana to cast Force of Will if he fights over Time Vault. But I have only exactly enough mana to do that, not enough mana to activate the key if Time Vault resolves. So I just put Time Vault on the stack, and my opponent is like, oh, well, I got to dig. Taps out of his only available mana to cast Brainstorm. The Brainstorm finds Force of Will. He Force of Wills, and I'm like, okay. And I could kind of tell he was in a brain space of ready to concede to anything. So I cast the Force of Will, and he's just like, oh, okay, good game, man. And I was like, yeah, good game. And I'm like, yep, as I picked up all my permanents real quick before I realized I didn't have the mana to give him another turn. It was a close one, and I might have still been ahead if we passed the turn, but, count every mana because it all matters sometimes. Round 5, I dumpstered some other Tinker Mirror. This was my turn 1 in game 2. Let's go through this. This was Black Lotus to cast Merchant Scroll. Or I probably played the Pearl first. It was Pearl, Lotus, Merchant Scroll with 2 blue floating, find Ancestral, cast Ancestral with 1 blue floating, Brainstorm, no mana floating, use Mox Jet and my land to cast Demonic Tutor, pass the turn. And I'm pretty sure I Demonic Tutored for Tinker here, and pass the turn with 6 cards in hand. This is turn 1. Welcome to Vintage, kids. This opponent, though, provided another side story from the weekend, which we can find here. This is my opponent's Time Walk, which is now my Time Walk. My opponent realized while we were playing that my time walk was signed by the artist, Amy Weber. And I don't like signatures. I just actively wish many of my signed cards were not signed. That's just how I got them when I got them. And my opponent's time walk was in slightly better condition than mine, and mine was signed. And the signature was valuable to him. The better condition was valuable to me. And we just straight up traded time walks right there in the tournament. It was pretty awesome. You don't get to trade power for power at 1-to-1 rate anymore. Everything is like condition this or addition that, or let's check TCG player. Let's, and it's usually money, but I just traded a time walk for a time walk, which is really awesome that I was able to just do that. Eternal Weekend, baby. Shout out to Mikey from Eminence Gaming, who I was staying with, and he showed up with a food delivery. I was not able to get to the market between rounds. The one thing that wasn't great about the setup for this weekend is we were in a room at the convention center that was about as far as possible from the Reading Terminal Market. Sometimes you can just dip across the street. It takes you 10 minutes to get there and back. But where we were, it was like a 10 to 12 minute walk each direction. It was like 3 city blocks to get to the market, and then you got to wait in line. So Mikey got me that Amish barbecue that I crave so much during Magic tournaments in Philly. Here is where my tournament ended, and this match, I played it out, but this is where I couldn't make top 8 anymore. This match was pretty incredible. I played against Doomsday, and in game 1, my opponent sculpted around Pyroblast, sculpted around Flusterstorm, really made a lot of good decisions where to deploy his counter magic. I think there was an early Thoughtseize that I countered, and then he played around as much as he could, but I ended up getting him with the main deck Dress Down. His last turn could pay for Flusterstorm and could win without casting a counterable blue card, I think, was how it split out. But I just got him with Dress Down. Game 2 was, my hand was full of good cards, and it was like Dress Down, Pyroblast, Flusterstorm. He resolved a Necropotence, paid 7 life to go up to 9 cards in hand, end of turn discarded 2 lands. He has 7 cards in hand that are the best 7 of the top 9 cards. So a little bit of selection, but he didn't like pay 15 or anything. And on my turn, I have Urza Saga go up to 2 counters, 2 lands, and I have Time Walk, Flusterstorm, Pyroblast, Dress Down in my hand. And my plan is to cast Time Walk. If he fights over it, I Pyroblast the counterspell. Then I take my extra turn, tutor with Urza Saga, have so much mana in play that he's never going to get through my wall of counters. And he ended up, from the 7 cards off of Necro, he had Force of Will for my Time Walk, Mental Misstep for my Pyroblast. That's the brutal one. The Mental Misstep, if he had to pitch to Force, that's another card out of the 7, and you don't get a draw step with Necro. So unless you can win with what you got to pass the turn again. But it was Force of Will plus Mental Misstep to fight over the Time Walk, which was really smart because a lot of players might not even have fought over Time Walk. They're like, okay, that's not the one that kills me, but it does effectively kill them because I get another draw step, I get another land drop, I just get so many resources going into the next turn that it was really smart to fight over the Time Walk, and really fortunate that the Mental Misstep was there. And I had to pass the turn, still thinking like, whatever, he's under Necro, he just used 3 of the 7 cards in his hand, and if I untap again, I'm in the same spot. But with the 4 cards remaining in hand, he went Demonic Consultation for my whole deck, tosses Oracle, GG. So it's a pretty good Necro, and it was just really close. I'm not complaining about variance or anything, just without the misstep in that mix, or if it wasn't Force Misstep plus Thassa's Oracle and Demonic Consultation. Consult and Misstep are both restricted, by the way. Like, it was just, there's a lot of alternate universes where I just 2-0 this match and on we go. And unfortunately, we're not living in one of them. And that continued to hit for game 3. I had turn 1 opposition agent, which pretty good against a Doomsday, let me tell you. And my opponent went Underground Sea, Mox Jet, Time Walk, second turn, Watery Grave, untapped, Dark Ritual, Sheoldred. So just played effectively a turn 1 Sheoldred without searching his deck at all. And remember the spoiler from earlier where I said I ended up losing a game because Lightning Bolt couldn't get the job done in one spot? I didn't have a Brazen Borrower, didn't have a Chain of Vapor. I'm not in the colors for Swords to Plowshares or anything. I just had no way to remove Sheoldred. And it just killed me. Just 1, 2, 3, off we go. There was a little bit of interest in the mid game where I was able to get Bolas's Citadel into play at 9 life, but I can't draw extra cards because drawing extra cards triggers Sheoldred, which means I have less life to play Bolas's Citadel off of. So this Bolas's Citadel's in play. I managed to end step Dress Down in my opponent's end step. So I get a whole turn where Sheoldred is turned off from 9 life to try to make something happen with the Citadel. And it just didn't happen. I ended up runnering lands, or it was like land Force of Will, like something I couldn't cast right away. And as soon as Sheoldred was back on, my life total was too low. Really great, tight vintage Magic. Sucks I came out on the wrong side of it. I presented potent game plans in both game 2 and 3, and my opponent had exactly what he needed to do in both times. So GG's. The next one, I am not going to lie, I was kind of... I don't think I was on tilt. I was just more like, I'm dead anyway. I'm willing to take a risk. I kept a hand in game 3 against Hank Zhang, who ended up in second place of the Legacy main event. Congrats, Hank. He was on a Grixis mid-range. It's still a Tinker deck, but he had like Narset and Dak Faden and more mid-range stuff in there to win a longer game. And in game 3, I kept a hand that was on the draw. I kept a hand that was Mox Sapphire, Preordain, Ponder, Flusterstorm, Pyroblast, Demonic Tutor, and like some other card. So only Mox Sapphire for mana, but on the draw with a Ponder, I get 5 looks at any additional land or other mana source, any like Mox or whatever to keep it going. And exactly what I want to be doing in that matchup is cantripping while holding up Flusterstorm and Pyroblast, and my hand had those cards. So I drew for turn. It was not a land. I pondered, missed on the land, shuffled, drew. It was not a land. And I ended up finding an off-color Mox. I think it was like Pearl or Emerald, something that wasn't helpful, but at least was something. And he ended up having Dak Faden, which took my Mox Sapphire and then just took control of over the game. By the end of the game, he controlled my Mox Sapphire, my Mox Ruby, and my Soul Ring, and Dak was still in play. And I never had a land. It was a rough one, but I would have mulliganed that hand just out of discipline if I was X1 instead of X2 at the time. And the final round, I didn't know what I was playing against in game 1. And my opponent had like a scrappy little mono white, here's a Thalia, here's a this or that, and poke me to death while I couldn't really function. Because I kept a hand that was just kind of lands and spells and ready to fight against a variety of things, where White Stompy specifically just picked it apart. In game 2, when I was on the play, knowing that they were a mono white deck, I killed them on turn 1. There was a like Black Lotus, Demonic Tutor, Tinker kind of hand where I assembled Time Vault Voltaic Key or Manifold Key on turn 1. And then in game 3, my opponent went Plains Go on the play. So on the draw, I went Land, Lotus, second Mox, Brain Freeze, put Brain Freeze on the stack for 9, and I had the Underworld Breach in my hand, so it's another turn 1 win. But he had the Mindbreak Trap this time. So he countered all my Brain Freezes, exiled those. I had to pass the turn, and then in his end step, cast Mystical Tutor for Tinker, and then Tinker on my turn to win the game anyway. So instead of a turn 1 win, I presented a turn 1 win and had to win on turn 2 instead. Just rough beats on that one. But that's why I like playing hyper busted decks. People love playing decks like White Stompy or Hate Bears or the Bant Initiative or Noblefish. And the power decks really do just, they're on a different plane of existence than those decks. And if you don't let them drag you into the mud, then they die very quickly. That's not to say that deck isn't good. It had a really good top 8 conversion rate. I think it was 3 of the top 8 decks, including my friend Stu Summers, who borrowed the cards from me to play White Initiative and ended up in the top 8 of the tournament with it. No disrespect to the deck or anyone who plays it. Just when I approach Vintage, I would rather be the one dumpstering these decks than the one trying to stop the super busted stuff. I finished exactly 32nd place, which I thought was good for $200, but it turns out I was looking at the wrong attendance level distribution and there was no prize for top 32 at all. It stopped at top 24. So after a brief moment of celebration, immediately sent back to Earth.
You come here to level up at Magic. To level up as a software engineer, check out the new YouTube series Dev Better, hosted by the founder of 7-Factor Software and Magic player, Jeremy Duvall. 7-Factor's small teams of high-performing engineers build custom mobile apps, APIs, and highly scalable systems for Fortune 500 companies and ambitious startups with great ideas. If you'd like to hire 7-Factor, or maybe join their team, contact them through their website at 7factor.io. And don't forget to subscribe to 7-Factor's YouTube for every episode of Dev Better.
Day 2 was the Legacy main event, which, to the surprise of no one, I played Hot Bant, called 4-color control, Bant splashing red. Things that I did for this tournament are I main decked 2 Dress Downs out of respect for White Initiative. I main decked a Pyroblast out of respect for basically most of the format outside of White Initiative. I have a Torpor Orb in the sideboard, also out of respect for White Initiative, but these Torpor Orbs and Dress Downs, they're also really good against Doomsday, which is a close but tough matchup. They're all really good against Death and Taxes, which is a close but tough matchup. And I wouldn't have played 3 cards like this that just hard targeted mono white. Like, I'm not playing Unchained Berserker or Empty Shrine Kanushi or some protection from white creature. These are all things with overlap against other matchups that help push other tough matchups into the correct direction, which is exactly how you want to construct a Magic deck. That's what I did to address the White Prison or White Stompy. I played Brotherhood's End in the tournament. I do think this sideboard slot needs more experimentation. I didn't get enough reps with Brotherhood's End to be confident about this card, but being able to collapse my second Kozilek's Return and my second Meltdown into a single sideboard slot and then make room for something else is really appealing. Even if the card as printed isn't worth much more than the sum of its parts, the sum of its parts plus another sideboard slot, it starts to get really appealing at some point. So I tried it. Spoiler, it barely came up once again. But yeah, this is pretty close to what I released in my testing. All of my videos are up for that. Go check those out. But yeah, Hot Bant was the play. Started the day with more pretzel breakfast. Normally, tournaments start on Saturdays, and then the pretzels are closed on Sundays because the Amish don't work on Sundays. But this event started Friday, so I got to double down on pretzel breakfast 2 days in a row. Feeling good about that. Round 1, I got paired against 12 Post, mono green 12 Post, which historically has been one of those decks that where you register a control deck in Legacy, expecting to play against the decks you'd expect, and then you get paired against 12 Post in round 1, and you just start 0-1, and you start thinking about your life choices, like how the hell did we get here? What the heck? If I just won round 1, I would never see that deck because it doesn't win matches, and that's just like, I've been in that mind state before where you just get paired against a completely off the radar, horrendous matchup for your deck in round 1. Luckily, though, Hot Bant is prepared for that. Life from the Loam, 2 Wastelands. I was just able to pick them apart, work through it. In game 1, he Pithing Needled Minsk and Boo before he saw Wasteland, and I was able to get Wasteland going. I think he made a short-sighted decision in our game 1 where he used his second Pithing Needle to name Caracas before killing or exiling my Uro, so I couldn't save the Uro with Caracas. but then I was able to find Loam and get Wasteland going and dominate the mid game where he had a Pithing Needle that he couldn't name Wasteland with. Like, I don't know if Uro was going to beat Ulamog anyway. Did you really need to name Caracas? Could have just exiled the Caracas with the Ulamog that was cast. I don't know. Like, hindsight's 2020, but I was very glad that my Wastelands were able to pick this opponent apart, because historically 12 posts is just unwinnable for blue control decks. Here I said, there are only 8 rounds today. I was ready to play 10. That's like starting 2-0. Spoiler, this was a 10-round tournament. There was just only 8 rounds played on day 1. And then the last 2 rounds of Swiss were played on day 2. But I didn't fully understand this at the time, and I thought I was playing an 8-round tournament. I was looking around the hall like, this looks like a lot of people. How are we only playing 8 rounds? But I'm not going to argue with it because that's good news for me. But yeah, spoiler, it's a 10-round tournament. Round 2, I beat Newton Elves, the Fiend Artisan, Cradle Control, whatever we're calling that these days. It was a really tough matchup, but like we talked about in the deck tech, I'm built heavy for creatures due to initiative. I have a second Terminus, I have Brotherhood's End and Kozilek's Return, multiple dress downs to turn off Allosaurus Shepherd and other stuff, and I was able to just pick it apart. Round 3, I was on camera. I played against Bug Alurin. I had a tough call in game 1 where I could tell that the deck was shaping up that it could be Alurin, and I had Wasteland in my hand that could have taken out a Tropical Island, so he'd only have 3 mana going into his turn, and he couldn't cast Alurin because it's a 4-drop. But if he wasn't about to cast Alurin, then that would have been a really terrible Wasteland. And I decided to advance my board instead of playing the Wasteland, and then he just jammed Alurin. And my hand at the time was like 3 Swords to Plowshares, no counter spells. Luckily, though, his kill was Acererak rather than Dreamstalker and going super wide against removal. And when he went for the Acererak, I was able to plow it. He forced, I plowed again, and he was not able to protect it. Then he passed the turn. I Prismatic Endinged the Alurin, 4-color control. Getting 4 colors on your Prismatic Ending is one of the reasons you do this. I was able to exile the Prismatic Ending, and we played a super long, grindy game 1. All of that is over on Onsi's stream VODs if you want to check those out. That I ended up winning. Game 2, I made a mistake that ended up costing me the game. What happened was my opponent resolved Alurin again, and I had Dress Down in my hand, and I had Terminus in my graveyard. And my opponent had whatever that new blue 3-drop is, some wizard that you choose, draw a card, bounce a permanent, or something else when it comes into play. I forget the name of it right now. That card was in play from a previous turn, and my opponent put Cavern Harpy on the stack, which is the combo. You can basically pay 1 life to draw a card until you find Uro, and then you just win, because then you gain 2 life to draw a card with Cavern Harpy and Alurin. And I had Dress Down in my hand, and Terminus in my graveyard, and a fetch land available. I knew I could cast Dress Down. Once Dress Down resolves, fetch from Mystic Sanctuary to get Terminus out of my graveyard, draw the Terminus, flip it, and clear the board. But in my head, I was like, that doesn't answer Cavern Harpy, because Cavern Harpy's on the stack, and if I ever let it resolve, then they can just go off in response, and it'll be too late to Terminus it then. I guess I'll just take a draw step and hope to draw Swords to Plowshares to kill the Harpy while it can't bounce itself because of Dress Down. But what I got like 2/3 of the way through that puzzle, and the last piece of that puzzle was the Harpy doesn't matter if that wizard isn't in play to bounce and draw an extra card with, and the Terminus would have swept that up. So I missed on the Swords to Plowshares, and then in my end step, Dress Down died, and it turned the Cavern Harpy back on, and Alurin lets you operate at instant speed, so opponent just comboed then. And I ended up losing when I had a play that I did not play to. And then game 3, our first 2 games took a long time. I answered 2 Alurins. My opponent cast it, then couldn't win, and I exiled it. Then he cast another one, still couldn't win. I exiled that. And then we were starting to stabilize the board, and I was about to resolve Minskin Boo when we ran out of time. And there was more game to play, but I felt ahead. Unfortunately, we ran out of time. That comes with the territory of this deck. My next pairing was into Ruby Storm. in the draw bracket. When I sat down, my opponent was kind of bleeding cards a little bit when he was shuffling. I saw like a red card. I couldn't tell what it was, but I saw the face of a red card. I could tell it was a red card. And then he kept shuffling. And then I saw Lotus Petal and Burning Wish. And I was like, okay, this is the Epic Storm. And then my brain was like, why is a Storm deck in the draw bracket? Oh no, I'm going to have to ask this person to play faster during our match. And it turned out he was Ruby Storm, not the Epic Storm, but still in that same wedge. And also, by the way, shuffle tighter. Whoever you are listening to this, just make sure your opponent can't see the face of your cards because that's important information. I mulliganed a hand that I would have kept and would have died because I knew my opponent was on Storm. Anyway, my opponent's on Ruby Storm, and he was in fact being really deliberate, really careful, counting everything multiple times, using up a lot of the clock. I did make a polite request to play faster towards the middle of game 2, and he really did listen and play a lot quicker, and we were able to finish the match with 3 minutes left. This one was a wild ride. I had all of my blasts in after board. I was really glad I had a Force of Negation in my sideboard, which is not a card I normally play. All the blue blasts against all the red cards, all the red blasts against Echo of Eons, which is an important part of their deck. And I was force of willing defense grids to I was forcing with basically reckless abandon because I figured eventually I'd be echoed into more cards, and I don't want defense grid in play when that happens. And we really just rounded out to the wire. And game 2, I survived the first 2 waves, and then Collector Roof showed up, and I felt a lot more comfortable. And then I was able to get real pressure in and win the game with 3 minutes left on the clock. The next round, I played against Green-White Depths. Game 1, my opponent mulled to 5. I answered his Sylvan Library on curve. I answered his next 2 creatures, and he was out of gas. But then I just had lands. Just lands and lands and lands, and my opponent was able to assemble Elvish Reclaimer, which started moving towards Dark Depths, and by the time I got anything going, I was already under the gun from a protected Merit Lage and just couldn't make it happen anymore. And in this game, I did make a mistake where I spent a turn. I had Wasteland in my hand, but I couldn't use it effectively because my opponent had Ramunap Excavator, and he would have just replayed the land. So on the last turn that I got in that game, I drew Prismatic Ending, which exiled the Ramunap Excavator, and then I Wastelanded Dark Depths immediately. If I had just sat Wasteland in play and make my opponent spend another turn cycle going for the Dark Depths combo, getting stuff by Wasteland, then reassembling Dark Depths combo, or spending a turn digging up their own Wasteland, but then they could fight over my Wasteland and win the fight, that sequence would have at least let me see another draw step. And when you're playing a deck like this with Ponder, Brainstorm, Expressive Iteration, another draw step can change the entire world. And I just kind of got in my head like, oh, this is my chance. The Ramunap's gone. Hit him now. Wasteland. And that ended up just being a huge mistake. That cost me a turn. I don't know if that turn would have changed the outcome, but that was a tough one to just watch slowly slip away from my opponent who was doing nothing versus me with a handful of cards and just, nope, not today. And game 2, I got clowned by Gemstone Caverns. Let's get that one up on the screen. My bad. It's not Gemstone Cavern. It's Hall of Gemstone. Gemstone Cavern is a very different card. Hall of Gemstones. I wrote Gemstone Cavern. Yep, that doesn't make any sense. Hall of Gemstones. 1 green. Enchant World. During each player's upkeep, that player chooses a color. Until end of turn, each mana-producing land produces mana of the chosen color instead of its normal color. This is like Choke on steroids. My deck can play around Choke. I've got many non-island lands. I have Prismatic Ending. I got lots of outs to a Choke. But Hall of Gemstone, I have to choose each turn. Am I going to have blue so I can cantrip? Am I going to have white so I can cast removal spells? And many of the best cards in my deck, my deck's not up on the screen anymore. Expressive Iteration, a gold card, not possible to cast. Uro, a gold card, not possible to cast. Minsk and Boo, a gold card, not possible to cast. This just absolutely dumpstered me. I've never seen this out of green white depths before. I imagine it was just in the choke spot, and I had Force of Vigor. I was live to still remove it, but it did not go that way for me. I did not find the Force of Vigor before my opponent assembled. Merit Lage and just punched through. Tough loss on that one. And my final round of the tournament, I did not play it out. This round, I heard the judge make an announcement saying, like, welcome to round 6. There's 2 more rounds tomorrow. And I was like, wait, there's what? This is when I learned it was a 10-round match, because I was already trying to hype myself up. It's like, all right, you just got to win 3 in a row to make top 8. It suddenly became 5 in a row, which is a lot more Magic to win in a row. And because I was in the draw bracket, I was live to get paired into tough matchups like red-green lands. Hot Bant is built to play a long, grindy, ugly game, but not even close to the scale of long, grindy, ugly game that red-green lands is. It was straight up like Rishadan lands from the ancient times, and I was not well prepared for this matchup at all. In game 1, I was a turn behind on Life from the Loam. Like, my opponent was clearly run out of gas after a really strong start. And I was like, okay, this is it. This is my chance to punch through. And then he cast Life from the Loam, which he would have cast on any earlier turn if he had it. So it was clearly the draw for the turn. And that Life from the Loam put it out of reach. And then game 2, I boarded in my Force of Negation. And my opponent resolved his first Life from the Loam, which picked up Wasteland, Ghost Quarter. I don't know if you looked at my mana base, but holy shit, that's bad. And I drew Force of Negation the turn after that happened, which eventually did exile the Loam, but my opponent already had the opportunity to use those 3 strip mines against me, and I wasn't quite able to catch up with that. I was just a turn behind on the interaction for that Loam, and that was that. Opponent squeezed me out, got me into a waste lock, and we're done. Which I was kind of relieved about, because I didn't want to come back in the morning and then have to 2-0 to have a chance at anything. It is kind of a joke in the grinder community. After first place, the second best record is 0-2 drop, because you get your whole day back. That's kind of how I felt here. But serious postmortem. That dress down play versus Olorin cost me a win. It ended up being a draw instead of a win, which would have kept me out of the draw bracket. And then I don't see lands. And, you can invent this whole like alternate timeline where you're not in the draw bracket, so you don't have to see these matchups that are tough. And against green white depths, I got a little aggro with that Wasteland that cost me a draw step that might have changed everything. Hot Bant makes you play perfectly and play fast, because it's a slow deck with tons of micro decisions, and I had a draw and a punt. I didn't play perfectly and I didn't play fast enough, and you got to win the first game in case you don't have time for a second. You really want to win game 2 in case there's not time for a third, and I was not able to deliver at the level that the deck required. So that was the end of my tournament, and totally on me. I could point to spots in my draw and one of my losses where I just messed up, which I love about Legacy and Magic in general, but especially Legacy. In these blue cantrip decks, if you really dig it apart, you can probably find a spot where you lost that game. The whole, oh, my opponent just drew better than me, shrug in the air, variance, whatever, barely, it doesn't matter as much as people want it to. You can find where you lost, and this is where I found where I lost. Good news, though, Mikey was on his way to the venue with the Herschel's Reuben, which is another Philly staple, and I got to eat a Reuben while I hung out and was no longer in the tournament. And we've come back full circle to my deck list. Heng Zhang, who I mentioned in the vintage part, ended up getting second place in the Legacy main event with 4-color control. I have not taken the time to study his list yet. We're going to break that down on Eternal Glory this week. But yeah, I've known Hank for a long time. I know he watches the channel. He told me that he uses my content to keep up with what's going on when he can't do all the testing himself. And he took 4-color control, the old BoshNRoll Hot Bant, straight to the finals. So I'll take that as some sort of comfort. And that was my Eternal Weekend 2022 experience. Shout out once again to Card Titan and Nick Koss for making it happen. We all appreciate it. Shout out to everyone who came. Shout out to all the friends who I haven't seen in 3 years, who I got to hang out with and get dinner with and do all that. And shout out to everybody who came up to me and said that they were there because they watched my videos. They got into Legacy over the COVID lockdowns because they were watching me, or they won their matches because they followed my advice, or whatever. Like, seriously, that sort of feedback keeps this shit going, keeps me on the air, and it means a lot. I love going out and meeting everybody, and Eternal Weekend is just the best weekend of the year for me. I look forward to it, and I'm so glad it's back. Thank you, everybody, for watching this and watching everything. To follow up on that, heartfelt, it's great to see everybody, but all of the subscribers who made this possible. And since we're talking about it anyway, if you didn't see my announcement on Twitter, if you don't follow me there, I'm going to be full-time Magic the Gathering YouTube content creator starting January 1st, 2023. So if you were thinking about my Patreon but haven't gone and clicked the link yet, or anything else that supports the channel, this is a great time to do it. I am going to be doing this, and only this, in just a couple weeks here. Thank you for watching, and whatever support you do provide, just clicking on the video is step one, and you've all done that. And if you can do anything else, I appreciate it. If you can't, I appreciate the continued clicks. Thank you so much for hanging out with me for another tournament report, and I'll see you for the next gameplay video.